So, folks, there is a man named Richard D. Wolf, and essentially he does this show called Economic Update. It's quite good. I fell off of it for a while during the pandemic because I thought some of his pandemic and Ukraine takes weren't necessarily the best. But I think generally speaking, he's pretty good when it comes to discussing the economics of socialism and communism and capitalism. I think he does a really good job kind of breaking them all down. And he's a professor of economics, so he knows what he's talking about. So yeah, I think it's gonna be interesting. But I watched this earlier today, so this is a pre-watch. I'm going to be upfront about that. But I think he makes some really, really good points in here, and it kind of a return to form for him in my mind. With that being said, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, because hey, it helps out the channel a lot when you guys do that, and I appreciate it. Frankly, even if you're hate commenting, I appreciate you too. You're helping me in the algorithm. Thank you for doing what you do. Fueling my inevitable rise. I appreciate it. And with that being said, let's dive into Economic Update: Reform versus Revolution.
Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives and those of our children. I'm your host, Richard Wolf. Today's program is devoted to a very old, a very perennial, and a very urgent topic for right now. I'm talking about the debate, the struggle between reform and revolution. Whenever societies are in stress, when basic problems have risen to the level of crises, like now, but has often happened also in the past, this issue, called do we respond by reform or do we respond by revolution, comes to the fore. About 100 years ago, the leader of the German socialist movement, very strong at that time as a movement, a Polish woman named Rosa Luxemburg, wrote a famous pamphlet titled Reform versus Revolution, because that was the issue in front of the socialists of her time.
And I do want to say right off the bat, I hope that my earlier segment that I did, and if you haven't watched that, go find it. The segment will be out by now on YouTube. Go check that out. Essentially gives my overall takes on these issues, and I'll be continuing to interject throughout this because I think he makes some really good points in this video that I would have a difficult time elaborating on. But I have a lot to say on some of them, so let's keep going.
Right after the First World War in particular. And it has resurfaced over and over again. And I'm talking about it with you because by looking at how it's been in the past, we can understand how it has become yet again, right now, the issue for us, you and me. One place to start, and we could at many points, is American slavery. At the time of the American Civil War, middle of the 19th century, we had a growing debate over the question of slavery. The southern states allowed, provoked.
We might speed him up a little bit. I find his cadence very relaxing when I'm listening normally, but on a show where I'm trying to respond to what he's saying, let's get to it a little bit.
Paid for endorsed slavery, and the northern states did not. And so the issue became, for everybody, what is our relationship to slavery? Now, of course, those who liked it, loved it, particularly those in the South who eventually fought a civil war about it, were happy with slavery, wanted to keep slavery. I put them to one side. They weren't involved in the debate over reform versus revolution because they weren't interested in social change. They were.
And I want you to remember this, okay? Like, the debate about reform or revolution does not take place with the opposition. It takes place within one movement, right? And that's why that's how we need to think about it in our current context as well.
Were interested in holding on to what they had. But let's take a look at those who didn't like slavery, who wanted to do something about it. The reformers were those people who reacted to slavery by wanting to reform it. That's why they were called reformers. And here's what they meant. Slaves should not be bought and sold in ways that separated parents from children, or husbands from wives, or siblings from one another. In other words, okay, you could have a slave, the reformer said, but there are limits, there are rules, there are things you shouldn't do and things you should do to make slavery less onerous, less awful.
And honestly, it was at this point when I was listening where I was like, this is actually a really good way of explaining this to normies. Like, this entire looking at the issue of slavery through this lens, I think for a lot of Americans, that makes this concept make way more sense. You know, do you just fight to improve the condition of slaves, or do you fight to abolish the institution of slavery itself? And I think that we all know the answer to which you should do in that particular case. You know, with the power of, hindsight being 2020, I think most of us know how we would have fallen on that one, right? And it's worth noting that that's a kind of thinking that we should maybe be bringing into our current mode of understanding our times.
Slaves should be clothed properly. Slaves should be housed adequately. Slaves should be fed decently. These were demands reformers made. Well, then what were the revolutionaries? The revolutionaries were the ones who said, you must go much beyond adequate food, clothing, shelter, treatment of slaves. For the revolutionaries, the problem was slavery itself. What they wanted was abolition, the end of it. Now, for most of the years leading up to the Civil War, most of the conversation was about reforming. That was thought as far as you could realistically go, even in the North. Those in the North who felt revolutionary was the response, end of slavery, were in the minority. They're remembered.
And yeah, right? Like, I think we're getting to it, but it's not just reform versus abolition. You need to understand in the context of the debate, abolition is the revolutionary action. It's the revolutionary path. It upends the status quo system and ends the oppressive practice of slavery, right? And so, like, I think this is an interesting way of reframing the question. Okay?
Remembered by names like John Brown and others who fought for and advocated the end of slavery. The reform versus revolution issue came to a head with the war, when the North and the South went to war in the American Civil War. And very quickly it became clear to the then President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, that to win that war, one important step was to end slavery. Lincoln took the revolutionary path. And the document that forever showed that was called the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that slavery was illegal. The 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution made slavery illegal in the United States anywhere and everywhere except inside prisons. A very debatable decision that was made, which if we had a lot of time, I would talk to you about. But there was a case in which the revolutionary option was taken. And just so no one misunderstands, it was quite an extreme act. Remember that African American slaves were widespread in the American South. Millions of people had spent money to buy slaves. That was their wealth. They may have had a piece of land, they may have had some farm animals, but they also owned slaves. That's what slavery means. So that the Emancipation Proclamation deprived Southerners, white people, of their property without compensation. The government didn't say, we're taking your slave away from you and here's money instead. They just said, your slave is now free to go. You don't own him anymore. And there's nothing legally you can do about it. That's what the Emancipation Proclamation made the law of the land. That's a revolutionary act.
And this is true. You know, I think one of the things we often don't understand is that revolution can in fact take place without like overthrowing the government. I think when a lot of people think of revolution, they think of for example, the French Revolution, you know, cut the heads off the king, you know, or the People's Revolution in Russia, you know. And there is, I think, this association that it has to be like a bloody affair that involves mass slaughter, right? But that's not what revolution. That's not the only interpretation of a revolution. In like the sense of like political science, right? Like revolution is simply a rapid and profound shift in like the actual functioning of society. You know, whether that's along like class, state, ethnic, religious grounds, etc. Like those can be
When I think of
revolutionary.
I think of Revolution
you know?
X, the arcade shooter game with Aerosmith.
That is a deep cut, Saki Tanuki, but I love it. Thank you for the 5 tier 1 subs. And yeah, revolution doesn't necessarily mean violence, right? It can often include it or, you know, have it thrust upon a revolution, but it doesn't necessarily need that, right? So, you know, we're gonna get to we're gonna kind of get to this, all right?
I want to now jump to a different example where reform won, and then you'll see how that comes and shapes our situation now, here in the United States. The example I'm taking is the Great Depression, the 1930s. Let's remember that was a period of strife. It wasn't about masters and slaves, because that problem had been ended in large part by the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. No, in the 1930s, it was about a great struggle between employers, or capitalists, if you like, and employees, or workers, if you like.
Yeah, like when Bernie Sanders has a group titled Our Revolution, Bernie Sanders is not calling for a violent overthrow of the United States government.
Maybe even if you don't like. And the problem was that the capitalists who hired workers fired them as well. And they fired lots of them, starting in the Great Crash of 1929. And by 1933, the unemployment rate in the country was 25%, 5 or 6 times what it is now. And in that crisis, with hungry, desperate, unemployed people, let's remember in the early 30s, there was no such thing as unemployment compensation. There was nothing taking care of elderly people kicked out of their...
The Great Depression happened like 50, 60 years after emancipation.
Jobs, there was no Social Security. It was a really difficult, hard time. And a lot of people wanted change. A polite way of saying we want out of the misery, the unemployment, the suffering, the poverty that was everywhere across the country, from Florida to California to Maine and everywhere in between. And here come the reformers and the revolutionaries. The reformers said there ought to be, I'll come up with it, there ought to be unemployment compensation. We ought to do something for unemployed people who lost their jobs through no fault of their own. The whole system broke down. Their work wasn't deficient. Their behavior wasn't inappropriate. They were working one day as well as they were the next, except they were fired. And we ought to help them. And we ought to have unemployment compensation. The government should help unemployed people. That's a reform. We should also have a minimum wage. It shouldn't be possible for a man or a woman to work all those hours and get paid so little that they can't live. There has to be a minimum. The employers won't recognize a minimum. They're always wanting to push it down anyway. So the government has to step in. Notice, the reformers turned to the government, and eventually they said there should be a Social Security system. Well, then who were the revolutionaries? The revolutionaries were the ones in the 1930s who said the solution isn't fixing it. Because this was their best argument, even if you fix it, if you have a minimum wage, if you have unemployment compensation, if you have Social Security, if you get it from the employer by asking for it, then you leave the employer in the position to take it back when and if they can. What you need, here we go now, was a revolutionary situation, something that could not be undone afterwards.
And this, I think, is like the crux of the point here that I find the most interesting and compelling, right? Because he's correct here, right? That essentially the reforms of the New Deal, and this is again why I tend to be a bit skeptical of FDR, the reforms of the New Deal were implemented in such a way that it made them possible to roll back, made them possible to undo. And for the past, 3 generations, the wealthy of this country have consolidated their power generation by generation, passing it on, growing it, consolidating it, and that takes place both via, the descendants of robber barons, to the CEOs of these mega corporations that have consolidated over and over again until you have these mega corps that control almost everything, and like that has concentrated so much power in so few hands that now you have basically like oligarchs being invited into our governmental structure itself to just directly run things, right? And this is a direct result of the failures of the New Deal, the failures of subsequent generations to keep up those protections. And my main argument here is that those failures are an inevitable outgrowth of the capitalistic system, because there is an incentive structure in place within capitalism to subvert any regulation, any controls put on a large enough collection of capital. Right? And the more power you concentrate into those fewer and fewer hands, the more incentive they have to break the regulatory structure imposed upon them by the state. Right? And so you have like this time period from like the Great Depression and through to, the 1970s, where those protections remained relatively agreed upon, because it was recent memory that people were being worked to death in the factories. The Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire was not that long ago in the public consciousness. The idea of the company town and the Pinkertons showing up to kill you, not that old, right? And so these worker protections were protected for a time. But then they became ingrained in society. People took them for granted, and Republicans, with their even more consolidated wealth, attacked, and that's where you get the deregulation of the Reagan era. That's where you get the destruction and crushing of the union movements. It's because of that concerted and continued and perpetual economic advantage and disposition towards destroying the regulatory structures imposed upon them that capitalism and government are eternal foes. But this is something that even, if we go back further, we understand. We know that, right? Like Lincoln himself talks about this idea that there is an eternal battle between essentially tyranny and freedom. And when you have a system that inevitably consolidates wealth into the hands of a few, what ends up happening over the longer term is that system will eventually consolidate it into the hands of one, And it is through that lens that I find capitalism inherently tyrannical, right? It creates little tyrants of us all, and in the long term subjugates us to that collection of capital, that collection of economic and political power. And that's why I think it's bad, right? And that's why the reforms of the New Deal were not enough. And why instead what needed to happen was some kind of revolutionary new approach to our economic system, right? And my argument would be, of course, to disperse that power out of the tyrannical, capital owners' hands and instead place it into the hands of individual workers collectively owning and operating their workplaces, right? And so that's my argument and my entire political ethos, right? So that's why I call myself a socialist. And I think that we need some kind of mechanism that is implemented, that is a shift from the capitalistic status quo that ensures we just much like how we abolished slavery, gigantic asterisk in most cases, we need a revolutionary approach that genuinely changes the status quo in a way that capitals can't simply dial back. Because what we're seeing right now with the $880 billion in proposed cuts to Medicaid is the attempt to kill the last vestiges of the New Deal ethos. Right? What we are seeing right now is the culmination of the attempt to roll back these worker protections. And that's not to say that, democratic socialism, or democratic, control of the workplace is going to fix everything. There are going to be bumps to iron out, of course, but we need a system that doesn't consolidate this power in the way that we've been seeing. That is simply a truth. Because what we're seeing right now is inevitable in capitalism. So, moving on.
And what would that be? Well, they all pointed in those days to the Soviet Union, which had had a revolution back in 1917, and that was only 13 years before.
Snugin, I agree that it's possible that democratic co-ops could consolidate wealth in a way that you're proposing. I just think it's far less likely that democratic co-ops are going to do that. Again, it's not a perfect panacea. There are going to be holes in the system, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with them. But ultimately, that's the best defense I know for this kind of wealth consolidation, because I can guarantee you that you're people who work at a place aren't going to collectively vote to make one person the billionaire, that I don't think there's going to be I don't think that's going to happen. I do think that the mechanism for preventing too much capital from accruing into too few hands is the system we already have, which is taxation, And it could be that part of the solution to that problem, Snugan, is that the government in some particular instances, like with like energy production, does need to like have a less democratic structure to it. I don't know. I'm willing to give it a shot, but like ultimately, I agree there needs to be like some fail safes in place.
Or the 1930s started, so it was in everyone's mind. We don't want the government to tell corporations they should pay a minimum wage. They'll get out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Forlorn 79. The answer to high wealth is progressive taxation. Yeah.
We want the government to take over. That became the revolutionary idea. The government would take.
Ooh, that good question, Brutus Magnuson. Do you think Nordic social democracies will ever fall to the same type of tyranny? Yeah. I think you can see it right now. In a lot of the Nordic countries, there are growing conservative movements that seek to privatize those social security nets that they have, and looks to dismantle it. You know, there are a lot of places, a lot of like conservative money in those countries trying to weaken union power and trying to, you know, break the social welfare. And like that is something you can see at work. You know, you can see it in how Elon Musk is trying to go to war to break like the unions in Sweden. You know, you can see it in the degradation of social services in the UK. You can see it all over different European nations. This is not merely limited to the United States.
Over the enterprises to make sure that people weren't unemployed, to guarantee a job, to guarantee a minimum pay so that no one would ever again be a poverty-stricken person. No one. And to make sure that there was a pension for everybody and so on. The government would come. That was the revolution.
And true, Dorothy, I'm just going to read your comment. Whether living under feudalism, socialism, communism, or bourgeois capitalist democracy, governments are a superstructural element which exists to reinforce the economic base and to protect the interest of the ruling class. And yeah, that's true. Which is why ultimately I am in favor of like the dissolution of the state. However, I think that is also something that is going to take a very long time for us to overcome as like a structural element. I think the state will likely be one of the last structures to go, and it's why I think like looking at statelessness as like an end point is probably like the last thing. You know, like if communism is a stateless, classless, moneyless society, you know, I think that you'd probably lose classes, then money, and then the state. That's just kind of like how I think things would probably go over a long-term basis, but that's just, you know, my speculation.
Revolutionary situation. And the people who advocated it in those days were mostly people in the American.
Are you an ANCOM? Like, I think at heart, maybe. I just don't find it particularly practical to advocate for anarcho-communist like as like a thing I will ever see in my lifetime. So instead I choose to talk about the way, like kind of the next step, the way I think we can currently make things better based on like data and evidence that I have. And so that's why I talk about socialism. That's why I talk about democratic worker co-ops, etc. It's not because I think that's what like perhaps we would have in like an end state or like a much better world, but I think it is the first doable step to make our world better. And I'm also open to the idea that maybe I'm wrong. You know, like I'm not married to like that particular title or label, I guess. Mostly I'm comfortable just calling myself a socialist and, you know, advocating for workers to control their own workplaces, because that's, I think, one of the biggest and most necessary steps for us to actually improve things.
Communist Party.
Yeah, like I think it's hard for people to imagine money not existing, let alone states not existing. So like let's go with the thing people can imagine right now, which is democratic worker co-ops. It has such a great /adult take on anarcho-com. Yeah, I just you know, people lived and died for thousands of years under feudalism, and I am not as shonen anime protagonist brained on the idea that I'm going to live to see like anarcho-communism implemented in our times.
and in the more radical of the two socialist parties. And at the height of the Great Depression, all of those people, socialists and communists, worked with the unions and began to push, some for the reforms, some for the revolutionary solution. And who did they push? Well, they pushed the president. At that time, Franklin Roosevelt.
And that's a good assumption, One-Eyed Heathen. I'm assuming that more participants in a system, the more complex it becomes, more parts mean more things that can go wrong, less parts make it simpler, but far less fail-safes. That's true. And that's why, and I've talked about this before in like the structure of democratic co-ops. Democratic worker co-ops, like that doesn't mean like your co-op is has a flat structure where like everyone is on the same playing field and there are no bosses. It just means you democratically agree on the structure of the organization, right? That's all it means. And so for some smaller democratic co-ops that only have like 3 or 4 employees, yeah, you can have a flat structure, right? But if you have like 30,000 people working in a democratic co-op, you're probably going to need more structure. You're probably going to need to vote on what that structure is, kind of agree on that. I think that it's going to be complicated, but it's kind of just my take on that. Did someone call for a failsafe? Failsafe, thank you for being a member for the last 4 months. I appreciate you.
Like the anti-slave reformers and revolutionaries had pushed the early.
I'm not at all convinced anarchy would ever be feasible or even desirable. Yeah, and like I'm fine not really engaging with that question because I don't think anarchy is really is really on the table in the way that I envision anarcho-communism actually being feasible. Like it's not on the table right now. It could be in the future. But I'll focus on the first actual tangible step I can take.
Earlier president, Abraham Lincoln. But Roosevelt went the reformist route, not the revolutionary. He established unemployment compensation. He established a minimum wage. He established Social Security, all of which we had never had before. And he went one further, government jobs. 15 million unemployed Americans got good jobs, working for the federal government, earning a decent income. They went the reformist route, but that meant the revolutionaries were dismissed.
Yeah, and this is basically where you get a lot of the revolutionary fervor of that moment. It just gets squashed because it was reliant on people demanding better. And this is why I talk about FDR being a compromise president. And did it help a lot of people? Sure, it did. But it also is what inevitably brings us to this particular position. And so, we are now being asked the same question again, reform or revolution.
They were pushed out of the story. Their proposals were not accepted. And what would they have proposed? The government take over, if you like, the Soviet solution.
And this is where I disagree a bit. I don't think the government taking over all these industries would necessarily be a good thing. And this is where I diverge a bit from Richard Wolff, but maybe that is what they would have suggested at the time. But I don't know that that consolidation of power makes me comfortable. I think that we have better solutions available. And maybe that's the solution they would have proposed at that time. I don't think it's the same proposal or solution to what we're facing now.
We've come to the end of the first half of the show. In the second, I'm going to take those 2 examples and apply them to the United States under Trump right now. Before we jump into the second half of today's show, I wanted to thank you for your very generous response to our fundraising efforts this year, and in particular in the last.
Also, just as an FYI, I do support Democracy at Work. I think they're a wonderful website with so many good resources on there. If you want to learn more about socialism, communism, etc., more left-wing economic ideas, Democracy at Work is great. They also have good coverage of historical leftist movements. They have a lot of great in-house research on democratic worker co-ops and implementing them. I genuinely like a lot of Democracy at Work stuff. So Just my endorsement, go check them out. All right.
Couple of months. And in part responding to that, we are extending the availability of our limited edition linen-covered hardcover version of Understanding Capitalism, the book I wrote and that we have been making available now for quite a while. If you are interested, I will be signing copies of that hardcover, and they will be available to you as they have been over the last few weeks. Just simply send an email to us at info@democracyatwork.info and put in the subject line limited edition. We will send you all the information you need to order and receive your signed copy of Understanding Capitalism in its hardback. And thank you again for your kind attention to the fundraising dimension of what we do. Welcome back, friends, to the second.
I like Richard Wolff a lot. I guess we have to ensure that the government remains democratic, to ensure nationalized industries work properly for the people of the country. And honestly, I would prefer to have as few nationalized industries as possible. And if they aren't they should be nationalized if they are in the direct public interest, I think that is a decent thing. Obviously, you'd have to have a lot of different criteria than that, but I'm always wary of consolidating that power, even in a democratic government. But if we had a broader economic base of democratic co-ops, I think that'd be totally fine. I'm wary, especially in the given time we're in, of lobbying the government and corrupting it in that way. Speaking of, we need to get money out of politics. Just throwing that out there as a constant refrain.
Second half of today's economic update. We're talking about reform and revolution. We've given the examples of slavery and the Great Depression. Now let's take a look at the last 75 years since the Great Depression was over. The most important economic reality of the last 75 years here in the United States has been the undoing of the reforms carried out by Franklin Roosevelt under the pressure of the socialist, communist, and labor movements of the United States.
And this is kind of the crux of it, right? The issue and the reason the question in front of us is reform or revolution is very specifically because for the past 75 years, we have been trying reform. This is the result of the reform route. If the reform movement and you can think of it as the reform experiment, right? If it were to have worked, it would have worked by now. We wouldn't be in a state where there are billions of dollars being funneled directly into our political apparatuses by the richest people on the planet. If reform worked, it would protect itself from these attempts to corrupt our governance. And yet it seems incapable of doing so, right? So that's part of the problem we are facing right now. And it's why our democratic leadership is essentially split between either, hey, maybe we should do something about people trying to destroy the country, versus people who are sitting around being no, we don't need it. We don't need to do anything about the country. Just let it burn. And then we'll be the only game in town. This is reform and revolution, unfortunately, at work. The current question within the Democratic Party is that very notion. Do you do something, or do you wait and then pick up the pieces and try to paste it all back together? Right? That's kind of the question here. But importantly, and it's worth, again, reiterating here, revolution in this context does not mean a violent uprising against the government. It doesn't necessarily mean that. Again, when Bernie Sanders' group is titled Our Revolution, he's not talking about fighting the US government with socialist super soldiers. He's talking about implementing political changes that amount to a revolution.
That's been our number one economic reality. The business community had been horrified by those reforms. Because remember, Who paid for Social Security, unemployment compensation? Who had to pay the minimum wage that was established? And who had to fund paying all those people getting government?
But Alan Smith, you have to ask, why do we have do-nothing centrists? Why do we have a wing of the party dedicated to doing nothing? And why do we have a wing of the party dedicated to doing something and appealing to people on working class grounds? You have to ask yourself, what incentives exist for these centrist Dems dedicated to doing nothing while the country burns? And the answer is money. It's not it's because they don't want to scare donors. It's because they are compromised by capital. They are being paid to not act, essentially. And so when you examine it through that lens, it is absolutely a question of people being lulled into inaction by this the end result of the reformist route, which is the mass consolidation of capital into fewer and fewer hands and the eventual overturning of the republic. You know, like the regulations against lobbying didn't get undone because no money was behind it. It's because these people spent 70 years, you know, working towards that point with all of their money and resources so that they could legally buy political favors. Not just from Republicans, but also from people like Chuck Schumer. Like, why does Chuck Schumer make up hypothetical people instead of actual constituents? It's because he's paid to prefer his hypothetical constituents. He has an incentive there to imagine that his constituents like him, as opposed to actually dealing with the fact that they don't.
Jobs. The answer, the business community. The wealthy people of America and the corporations that make them wealthy, you know, the top 10% that own 80% of the shares, they were taxed heavily, and they had to lend money to the government, whatever money they didn't get lost by taxation. So they were doubly angry. All of this effort by the government to help the mass of people at their expense. So they went to work to undo the New Deal.
They wouldn't be subservient to donors if Roosevelt lived another year and put his Bill of Worker Rights into the Constitution. True. But understand that Roosevelt alone was the one who was going to make that happen, not a reformist movement. We're talking about movements, not just individual people within those movements. And the issue is the reformist movement didn't do that, right? When you're saying the problem with reform is that it didn't go far enough, is exactly the point. It's exactly the difference between reform and revolution. That's exactly what we are hitting on, you know? And Amber Brains, that's exactly where we're going to go with this, actually.
They stopped government hiring of those millions of people, got rid of that. They nibbled away at unemployment compensation. They nibbled away at Social Security. From being a basic way people could live, it's now a support. But only poor people actually live only on Social Security. It's too small, so they've cut back. And forget about the minimum wage. The last time that was raised was in 2009. Even though we've had rising prices every year since, nothing has been raised in the minimum wage. We have behaved as a society savagely towards the poor people who depend on the minimum wage. So we have undone the New Deal of the Great Depression. It turned out that the corporations who had to pay for it and the rich people who had to pay for it got together and went to work to undo the reforms.
And by the way, if they do gut Medicaid this time around, they're going to come for Social Security next. You know, like their goal is not just to be content with the massive gutting of Medicaid. They want to take all of the money. They want to undo all of the New Deal. Okay? So like, yeah, that is what capital does over time. They are siphoning up as much wealth as they can. And if that means they can siphon up, you know, almost $1 trillion from Medicaid, that's exactly what they've been investing in corrupting the U.S. government to do.
And they have largely succeeded. That's what the Republican Party's number one priority has always been. Change the tax laws, change the inheritance laws, do everything necessary for corporations and the rich to re-establish their absolutely dominant position relative to a mass of people who have economic problems all the time. Yep, we're back to where we were before the Great Depression hit, and all the statistics show it. And there's a lesson for us here. Reformers are the people who want to make a system work better for average people. They do. They're sincere. They mean it. But they don't want to take the step that might guarantee it. Let me go back to the slave example.
Yep. This is exactly it. And this is what kind of got my mind turning on a lot of this today, which is that this is one of the things we need to understand, is that reforms are not permanent. They can be undone. What we need when we are talking about profound changes to the status quo is not frankly, is not Medicaid. We need like an untouchable system that guarantees Medicare for all, so that we all are aware we are in the same boat. When they come for that coverage, they come for all of us. You know, that is why the fight against Medicare for all is like so all-encompassing. Because there's also a capital element of abolishing Medicaid. You know, like, they want to make sure we are paying all of the money into our healthcare. And so, like, if we establish something like Medicaid, something that pays these healthcare companies, eventually what winds up happening is that they have, you know, amassed a critical amount of wealth, and they're like, well, actually, you know what? You don't need to, subsidize healthcare anymore, because we're just going to extract all of the wealth directly from individual people who are powerless before our multi-trillion dollar company. You know, it is the power differential that allows them to be more extractive of our money. How much will you pay to stay alive?
Giving the slaves rules, establishing laws in slaves' societies. You must feed, clothe, shelter, and so forth. In these minimally decent ways, it's like the reforms of the Great Depression. They can be taken away if you leave the master-slave relationship, because the master has every incentive to undo the reforms that strugglers were able to squeeze out of them in the first place.
And this is a great example, I think, right? Like, if you were to go back in time and you are to try and reform slavery to make it less cruel or, you know, less overtly torturous, right? You know, you might pass laws that, like, say, if you're a slave owner, you have to meet X, Y, and Z, basic, obligations to your slaves, right? But those wealthy capitalist owners of those plantations are going to then bend their wealth to undoing those laws, right? And in fact, in a lot of cases, they might not even, bend their wealth to undoing the laws. They might just like corrupt individual government officials to turn a blind eye. You know, they might just not do them, you know? And so, like, I think that this is a decent example of an attempt to reform a system where the people with power in that system have every conceivable incentive and the power necessary to simply not do it. To simply say, no, we're not going to actually implement those reforms, because we'll make more money if we don't.
The employers of the Great Depression had every incentive, namely their profits, to undo the taxes they had to pay, the money they had to lend to the government, and so on. They didn't want this. They wanted the government to work for them, and they didn't want to have to pay for it. And so they undid the reforms. Okay, now we come to our situation here and now. The United States succeeded in the aftermath of the Great Depression in ruling out revolution. Revolution was associated with the evil Soviet Empire. The government was very bad. The government was intrusive. The government was dictatorial.
And I do want to really emphasize here that yes, I do agree that the Soviet Union is dictatorial, intrusive, and bad. I think that there is, of course, like American propaganda that might hyperbolize it to some degrees in some cases, but like in a lot of cases, no, it was in fact very bad.
All ways to suggest don't go anywhere near where those revolutionaries are. So all that the Republicans and Democrats debate are reforms. Each of them has some reforms they want and some reforms they don't, but the unspoken agreement between them
is he being sarcastic about that? Yes and no. He has some odd takes about the Stalinist policies, but like I think generally speaking he has a good grasp on the economics of this, and I think generally speaking he's correct, and so like I think he's useful for demonstrating the points he's making right now.
Is never to suggest anything that might look, smell, taste, or seem to be revolutionary. The state must be kept out. Some of you have a whole philosophy of that called libertarianism. The state is bad. The state is evil. The state grabs power. The state. Where does that come from? It comes from that split between reform and revolution that came into being around the time of the Great Depression and has been fought ever since, mostly by people who either don't want any change, the so-called conservatives, or many of the reformers who want to keep everything within the realm of reform because they're terribly afraid of the revolution. And we have problems now that are producing the same result.
No, he's not a tanky. He's just like, he's very economist-brained. And I hope you guys understand what I mean when I say that. And like he analyzes a lot of the Soviet Union through an economic lens, and like through that lens, the Soviet Union did a fuck ton in the span of like, 50, 60 years. And so that to him, that's what makes the Soviet Union interesting. But like, I don't endorse his like more positive view of some of that, But he comes out of like a background of like growing up and like learning about economics from people who refuse to talk about like any kind of communist ideas out of fear of government suppression and like arrest in the United States. So like, I understand why he has some of the takes he does. Let me put it that way.
Let's go back to that minimum wage story. It's $7.
He does have a little bit of the American diabolism. Exactly, Vegan.
And 25 cents, the federal minimum wage. That's outrageous in terms of what it is you can't afford if you work 40 hours a week and get $7.25 paid per hour. It's so gross that reformers in about 30 states have raised the minimum wage in their state, which they can do way above the minimum. Last time I looked, if I'm not mistaken, there are a number of cities and towns and states who have a minimum wage around $15 or more. That's more than double the federal. That reformers were able in those states to get the wages raised. That's like people who didn't like slavery because it didn't feed slaves properly were successful to sometimes get the slaves to be fed better. And you have that here now, too. We don't dare even talk about the reform that they did in the 1930s with the government hiring people who don't get a job in the private sector. That's a way of solving the unemployment problem. We have millions of Americans unemployed right now. The private sector has no work for them. They have no job. Does the government come in and give them a job the way the reformers did in the 1930s? Not at all. Lets them sit out there. Wow. We only discuss reforms, and half of them we don't do. But what would revolution be now? Would it be the government coming in? Well, the answer is no, because what reform and revolution mean, that changes too.
And this is where I was like, of course. Like, how did I not arrive at that conclusion, right? Like, this is why you always seek out new and better ideas, right? Because of course reform and revolution would change in different contexts. Like, of course it would. Like, why would it not? And I can't believe that I just was like, no, revolution is always, violent overthrowing of the czar. And that's just not true. And I think that is maybe one of the blocks I had considering a lot of, ways to talk about our current moment,
Form, what it means, changes, but so does a revolution. One of the things that was learned in the 1930s was precisely that even if you bring the state in, which Roosevelt did, as an employer, as a regulator, as a pension provider, as a minimum wage guarantor, even if you give the state a big role, if that's all you do, then the rich and the powerful remain the employers who gather the profits into their hands. They can, and our history proves that they will, undo the reforms. The lesson of the Great Depression and everything since has been that we shouldn't have gotten caught up in the reform versus revolution, because they shouldn't be seen as either or. They should be seen as reform and revolution. Why?
And that is a brilliant synthesis. That is a brilliant synthesis, because we have arrived at a point where it is no longer acceptable to put these two ideas in opposition to one another, right? Because what we need is a democratic, broad-based movement that is going to implement reform that is permanent. Right? It needs to, in a way that cannot be undone, change things for the better. And that is one of the things that I think has been missing from a lot of discussion in our more mainstream circles, within like discussion of what is happening within the Democratic Party. We need people who are willing to fight, not just for something that is marginally better that will just get ripped down in 4 years if a Republican gets in office. We need people who are going to make things better in ways that Republicans, should they come back into power, will not be able to undo. Okay? Because what needs to happen in a revolution is a massive and quick change, because it is not possible to mobilize a huge number of people over a prolonged period of time. That is very difficult to do, right? And in times of strife and turmoil, that becomes possible. But if we get reforms that make things better, but can still be undone, as history has shown us, it can kill the revolutionary ideas in the cradle, as it were. Like it can completely put a stop to them for, an entire generation or two, as we saw with the New Deal. Mass mobilization is very difficult to perpetuate because a lot of people, they want to go. David Hogg was on Bill Maher the other day and said, like, they want to they want to get laid. They want to eat good food. They want to get laid. Like, and that's what a lot of people want to spend their time doing. People don't want to be spending their time in the streets, like having to fight for their fundamental right to exist, right? And so I've been talking about how we're in this cool zone for a while, and the cool zone, again, it is a time of increased possibility. It is the opportunity window for us to mass mobilize and get something better, and that window does not remain open forever. So how you get revolutionary reforms is through mass mobilization while people are paying attention. Because ultimately those people want to go home, they want to raise their family, they want to be with their kids, they want to they want to go to the zoo, they want to go do stuff, So all I'm saying is we need to be moving forward with an idea, not just for fixing the things that are broken, but taking revolutionary steps forward. It's again, what Tim Walz has been saying. And Tim Walz is no revolutionary, but when he says people are going to expect Medicare for all after this, that's because it is a revolutionary improvement to what we did not have before, to an imperfect reformist policy that has been on the brink of destruction at the hands of Republicans for a long time. Okay? These are revolutionary in their nature. Making sure everyone, regardless of their economic circumstances or station, regardless of their beliefs, has health coverage and can go to a doctor if there is something wrong and get the care that they need. That is revolutionary. Okay? And we need to embrace more changes like that. We need a revolutionary approach to getting money out of politics, because the reform path is going nowhere. It is stuck in the mud and has been for 10 years. And so all I'm saying here is that this is a great way of thinking about politics in a way that I think is useful for us in reframing the actual question and focusing us on what we actually want. I don't think we can compromise with these corporate interests that seek to undermine us.
Why? Because the only way to secure reforms is by revolution. It turns out...
True, it also decouples work and healthcare, Amberbrains, exactly. A revolution within the workplace and the role of work itself, yeah.
That the way the reformers got slavery to treat the slaves better was by ending slavery. The only way to solve the problems of unemployment and poverty and all the other basic economic issues confronting the United States, which are now building to a crescendo.
Yeah, anytime, I think, again, the stigma needs to grow around Democratic lawmakers who constantly talk about access to healthcare or public-private partnerships, or any of these code words and buzzwords for we're going to give corporations a ton of your money while they overcharge you.
No, as a desperate government, that's what Mr. Trump's regime represents. A desperate government reaches out and tries unorthodox things, tariffs, firing hundreds of thousands of public employees. These are extreme actions, and they reflect the extremity of the dangers and the crises that have accumulated. They're acts of desperation. However cleverly they are choreographed in front of your evening television news, that's what they are. They are attempts to reform. Mr. Trump's tariffs want to reform the entire global trading system. With Mr. Musk, he wants to reform the entire federal workforce, what it does, how it does it, who does it. These are dramatic reforms. But what you'll never hear from the Republicans is one word about changing the capitalist system. And by that I mean, very simply, the arrangement in which, in every factory, store, or office, a very small group of people, the board of directors if it's a corporation, the owner, the operator of the business, the partnership if that's what it is, they make all the decisions. What to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. And of course, should surprise no one, they take care of themselves first. They're rich, you're not. They're powerful, you're not. They hire and fire, you don't. That's the difference. And the Republicans wouldn't say a word. But because of what happened after the Great Depression, the Democrats won't say a word about that either. During the last presidential election, neither Mr. Trump, nor Mr. Biden, nor Ms. Harris had one word to say about the employer-employee relationship and the imbalance of power and wealth inside every business that shows us.
Yep.
You want there not to be
a million petty tyrants,
an abuse of the mass of working people, then you're going to have to face it. They're going to have to be in charge. If you don't want masters to abuse slaves, you've got to end slavery. If you don't want employers to abuse employees, you've got to end that relationship. You've got to make the enterprise a collective democratically owned and operated institution. Then, when the people run it together, they're not going to give one guy $400 billion and everybody else wonders how they can pay for their kids' college education, right? Those kinds of results plunge us back into what Rosa Luxemburg wrote about, reform or revolution. But in the 100 years since Rosa wrote, and we learned so much from her, one of the deepest lessons is to not get caught again in the either or. You need a revolution because it's the only way to secure the reforms that people are willing to talk about, but are so afraid of seeing the relationship of the reforms they seek to the revolution. They are so afraid of even thinking or talking about, let alone making happen. Thank you for your attention, and as always, I look forward to speaking with you again next week.
So I think that this is a good way of thinking about it. Exactly, revolution secures reform. Our labor is our only bargaining chip. Yep. And so I think that a lot of this, right, it is good to understand what is happening from an economic perspective, because he's absolutely right. You know, the fascists who are in charge right now are primarily being driven not by ideology, but by specifically capital interest, you know? And that capital interest is interested in itself, in growing its own power. And that could and is currently extending to destroying the state in order to, loot the ruins, essentially. Right? That is the growing fascistic element within capital in this country. And around the world, even. It's not just limited to the United States. So again, we're talking about it in a U.S. context. This kind of change and kind of economic tyranny is growing, and they want to turn it from just economic tyranny to political tyranny as well, right? And where we're at here.
But Jack, if we were all communist, we wouldn't have computer and AI.
Yeah, it just is. I think it is important to understand that even in this late hour, the fascistic elements of our society are doing the bidding of capital. You know, this is an important thing to point out, right? And understand that they do, while they might be fine with revolution in a lot of different aspects, they are not fine with a revolution against capital, right? And this is why one of the reasons why corporate Dems, like Chuck Schumer, Wall Street Chuck, don't support fighting, because a lot of their donors stand to gain something from these tax plans, So it winds up being that this capital influence is not just limited to the Republicans. It's not just limited to the United States. It is a broad effort on a global scale. And one of the things we need to do is we need to identify the various mechanisms that capital is using to corrupt our system, and we need to make sure in the growing revolutionary moment that we are able to correctly identify those levers and shut them down and prevent capital tampering permanently. In the same way, ending slavery, at least at large, again, asterisk, was a revolutionary act. We need to find similar revolutionary acts that upend the system of capital, that constantly consolidates this power. So, there we go. Our battle against the fascists and their movement. Exactly. Also, Mr. Malachite, I'm just going to end this particular part of the segment here, reading your comment because I think it's really good. Abolishing the current dynamic looks at first to be much more drastic than the abolition of slavery was, but slavery was so much of a universal economic fact that, viewed from a properly historical perspective, the abolition of slavery did sound then to be incredibly vague, lofty, and drastic. Exactly. It's why John Brown was viewed as like a insanely far left heretic for his dedication to abolition. You know, it's why the system of capital came down so hard on John Brown. You know, because that capital system recognized what he did as a profound threat to the underlying order of slavery, right? And so what ended up happening is that John Brown, you know, when they have the song John Brown's body is moldering in the grave, but his soul is marching on, like, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about John Brown having lit a fire, that blaze destroyed slavery. That spark launched the Civil War. And so, like, John Brown was based, it's true. All that to be said, we need to understand revolution in slightly different terms and understand that what it means to be revolutionary changes from context to context. And in our current context, it looks like us fighting and mass mobilizing to get not just these fascists out of office, but to end the systems that got them into office in the first place. And that's what we got to do. If you're interested in radicalizing your local Dems, join our Discord. Reach out to Dragonfly. Dragonfly can help put you in touch with your local Dems and get you on a track to radicalizing them and making them actually effective at doing things and securing those those revolutionary reforms. Okay, and if you are interested in joining your DSA, reach out to GamerG in the Discord about joining DSA, getting involved with that. Because you can also join DSA and get them to help you radicalize your local Dems. It's kind of like a reciprocal relationship. Do both, okay? And with that being said, thank you for listening to me jaw about this for, I think, like 2 hours. We spent a long time talking about this, but I hope it was useful. Hope it was good, and we'll see you, because we actually have a third part that I think a lot of you people will enjoy. So let's go, folks. We did it. Segment done. Like, comment, and subscribe.
Riverboat Jack is coming to town. All the viewers gather round. Twitch and YouTube and Swishy streams. All that content is bursting the seams. Politics, gaming, and plenty more. Your sense of fashion you'll adore. So grab your stuff and hop aboard. We're going straight to Jack's Discord.